Step into a world of imagination where science meets mystery. On this channel, Sci-Fi Stories, you'll experience exciting sci-fi stories about futuristic worlds, space adventures, advanced technology, and unexpected twists. Every story is told in a natural human voice, not AI generated, to give you a more real and engaging storytelling experience. If you love immersive sci-fi tales and powerful storytelling, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
There is a question my people stopped asking 3 centuries ago. Not because we found the answer. Because every time someone got close to finding it, something happened to them. Something quiet. Something that ended careers, or ended lives, or ended the kind of sleep that doesn't leave you staring at the dark ceiling of a transit bunk at 0300, cataloging your own breathing like it's evidence. The question was this: what do you do when the thing you are hunting decides it wants to be found? I'm Sub-Commander Valharius of the 7th Containment Division. I have spent 11 years tracking biological threats across 6 systems. I have filed 412 incident reports. I have drunk more of the Galactic Union's truly terrible recycled station coffee than any living creature should survive. I have never lost a target. I am also, as of 17 standard hours ago, completely, categorically out of my depth. Because somewhere in the lower decks of this decommissioned orbital station, a station I sealed, a station I flooded with neurotoxin, a station I locked from 3 separate grid systems, something is moving. Not something. Him. The human. And the worst part? He's not running. He's waiting. I don't know for what. My sensors can track his heat signature through 4 layers of reinforced hull. I can hear, if I press the audio feed high enough, what sounds like humming. A rhythmic, tuneless, almost cheerful sound from a creature that should, by every physiological model we've built, be dying right now. He's not dying. He's redecorating. I need you to understand something before I tell you how this ends. I need you to understand what a human being is, not the way the field manuals describe them, those clipped, sterile paragraphs about bilateral symmetry and atmospheric preferences, but the way I came to understand it, the hard way, over 17 hours of watching one man systematically dismantle everything I built to stop him. He didn't escape me. That's the thing no one is going to believe when I file this report. He chose not to. This is what happened. The coffee was wrong again. I mention this not because it matters, it doesn't, not in the context of what happened, but because it was the first thing I noticed when the proximity alarm went off, and I find that detail embarrassing enough that I've been leaving it out of my verbal logs. The alarm screamed. My cup was halfway to my secondary breathing slit. And my first coherent thought, in the half-second before my brain caught up with the situation, was, this tastes like the inside of a recycling filter. Then, the alarm screamed again, and I put the cup down. Movement, Deck 7, said Ensign Prath from the secondary console. Her fronds were doing the thing they do when she's trying not to show fear, pressed flat against her collar ridges, very still, very controlled. She's young. She still thinks composure looks like stillness. Heat trace, single entity. Moving toward the sealed junction. How is there movement on Deck 7, I said. Not a question. More of a statement directed at the universe, at the architects of this station, at whoever approved the transfer orders that landed a single human prisoner in my custody on a station that was supposed to be empty. Sir, I know what the readout says, Prath. I'm asking how. We flooded Deck 7 with halcyon 6 hours ago. Standard concentration. Anything without an environmental suit should be, he has an environmental suit, sir. A pause. He had no environmental suit when we processed him. He appears to have made one. I looked at the feed. The figure on Deck 7 moved through the pale green haze of the neurotoxin cloud with the slow, deliberate gait of someone on a casual walk. He was wrapped in what appeared to be, and I want to be precise here, because I included photographs in my formal report and some of my colleagues did not believe me, strips of thermal insulation torn from the ceiling panels, sealed with what the materials analyst later identified as a combination of emergency adhesive foam and the melted down casing of 3 separate junction boxes. Over his face, a transparent drainage cover from the sanitation corridor, edges heat fused to the insulation collar with what I can only assume was some improvised friction process. It was, objectively, one of the ugliest things I have ever seen. It was also, objectively, airtight. "Where did he get the adhesive foam?" I said. "Emergency safety cache, junction 7C. He broke through a sealed panel. That panel requires a Class 3 tool to open." Prath checked her console. "He used his own belt buckle, sir." I picked my coffee back up. I don't know why. I took a sip. It still tasted terrible. I put it down again. His name, according to the transfer documents, was Sergeant First Class Dorian Vance. Human male, mid-30s by their age reckoning, which I've learned means something different depending on how that particular body has spent those years. In Vance's case, the years had apparently been spent doing things that left him with a collection of old tissue repair signatures that my medical scanner spent 4 minutes cataloging before it gave up and filed them under extensive. He'd been caught, or rather, turned over. That's the part that should have flagged something for me earlier. He hadn't been apprehended in the field. He hadn't been extracted from a combat zone. He'd been delivered by a mid-tier information broker named Choos, who claimed she'd found him on Waypoint Station trying to sell cargo manifests from a collective supply line. At the time I'd thought, smuggler. Low level. Manageable. I had not thought, why would a man like this be somewhere he could be found? I was thinking about it now. The station was called Meridian 9 in the Union registries, but nobody called it that. Everyone who worked transit in this sector called it the Nail. It jutted out from the edge of a debris field like something the universe had stepped on and forgotten to remove. Decommissioned for general use 8 years ago. Kept on the books as a containment annex for exactly the situations I handled, targets too sensitive for standard detention, too inconvenient for immediate processing. It had 42 decks. 1 security team, 6 personnel including me. 1 human prisoner. I'd run the numbers when the transfer came through. I'd looked at Vance's file, his service history, redacted in 11 places, which I've learned to treat as its own kind of information, his physical vitals. I'd run a standard threat assessment and come back with a number that was, I'll admit, on the higher end of normal for a human operative. But not exceptional. Not the kind of number that makes you reassign your whole team and double your containment protocols. The assessment model we used was built on 400 years of accumulated data about human behavior in captivity. I have since submitted a formal recommendation that the model be revised. He's stopped, Prath said. On the feed, Vance was standing in the middle of Deck 7's main corridor, in a cloud of neurotoxin, wearing a suit made of garbage, not moving. "What's he looking at?" I muttered. "The camera, sir." He was standing directly in front of camera 7-4, face turned up toward the lens, and this part took me a moment to process, waving. Not in distress. The slow, deliberate wave of a person who has spotted someone they recognize across a large room. I waved back. I don't know why. I was tired. The coffee was terrible. He couldn't see me anyway. "Sir?" "Seal Deck 8, I said. Reroute his heat trace to the secondary monitoring grid. I want a full structural map of everything he's touched in the last 6 hours. "Yes, sir." "And, someone bring me a different coffee." The structural map took 40 minutes to generate, and, when it came back I laid it on the main display and stood there looking at it for a long time. He'd been busy. In the 6 hours since his cell door had inexplicably opened, and, I'll get to the door, because the door deserves its own accounting, Vance had moved through the station in a pattern that did not look random. Random movement in a confined space has a signature I know well, spiraling, doubling back, gaps and lurches. The movement of something lost, or panicking, or operating on instinct. His movement had no gaps. No doubles. He'd gone from his cell on Deck 12 to the maintenance corridor on Deck 11 in 7 minutes, which meant he'd known about the maintenance corridor. He'd then proceeded, with brief stops, through decks 10, 9, 8, and 7, collecting, based on what the materials analysis was telling me, the following items: 3 junction box casings, conductive alloy, heat fusible, 1 roll of emergency adhesive foam, sanitation cache, 7C, 14 strips of thermal sealing insulation, 1 transparent drainage cover, sanitation, corridor 7F, 2 power cells from an emergency lighting cache, deck 8 stairwell, 1 length of pressure tubing. From a coolant bypass line, 1 very specific component from the communications relay on deck 9 that I only identified after running it through a specialist catalog, because it's not a part one ever expected anyone to know was there, let alone know how to remove without tools. That last item was a subspace frequency modulator. A small one. Civilian grade. My communications specialist, a very tired Keltian named Brovith, looked at the item and, then, looked at me. "He pulled that from the relay by hand?" Brovith said. "Apparently. That's, sir, that relay has been installed in that housing for 23 years. The threading alone, I know." Brovith ran her tendrils together in the Keltian way that means she is deeply uncomfortable and would like to be somewhere else. "What is he building?" I looked at the map. At the trail. At the collection of components that, individually, meant nothing, but, together meant something I was beginning to feel the shape of without being able to name it yet. "I don't know," I said. That was a lie. I was starting to have a theory. I just didn't want to say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud would require me to acknowledge that the situation had already progressed significantly past the point where I was in control of it. The door. Cell 12A, where Vance had been housed, was a Class 4 isolation cell. Magnetic lock. Secondary mechanical deadbolt. Emergency clamp on the external housing, the kind that requires a power cycle from the control room to disengage. The door had opened from the inside. Not forced. Not shorted. The lock had been disengaged in proper sequence, magnetic, then mechanical, then clamp. In the correct order. With the correct timing intervals to prevent the secondary lock from re-engaging automatically. The only way to do that from inside the cell was to know the sequence. Did anyone give him the sequence? I asked my team, very quietly, during the first emergency briefing. 6 faces. 6 sets of alien expressions that all translated to the same thing. No. Did the transfer documentation include? Standard transfer documentation doesn't include lock sequences, sir, said Prath. I know that. He couldn't have known it. I know that too. He'd been in the cell for 9 hours before he left. 9 hours with no tools, no external contact, no access to any system on the station. The cell had 1 cot, 1 waste facility, 1 sealed meal hatch, and a fixed panel on the wall for ventilation. I requested the full video record of his 9 hours in the cell. It was a very educational 9 hours. For the first 2, he slept. Not fitfully, actually slept, the long, still sleep of something that understood it needed rest and was taking it deliberately. The way soldiers sleep. Like it was a weapon he was maintaining. For the next 3, he sat on the cot and looked at the door. Not at the lock. Not at the hinges. Not at any specific component. He looked at the door. The whole of it. The way I've seen specialists look at problems before they've started solving them, the wide, absorbing look that takes in everything before it narrows. Then, he got up. He went to the ventilation panel. He took it apart using his fingernails and one of the buttons from his uniform jacket using the button's edge, in small repetitive strokes, on the fastening screws, for 2 hours. Patient. Consistent. He hummed while he did it. The same tuneless, rolling hum I'd heard on the Deck 7 audio feed. The ventilation panel hid nothing useful behind it. We checked, after. Just ductwork. But, the panel had a specific thing on its inner surface, a small printed maintenance schematic, as they all do. The schematic for this particular panel included, in one corner, a notation referencing the cell's power grid junction, including, because someone in the maintenance department had apparently decided thoroughness was a virtue, the junction's access codes and the timing sequence for the electromagnetic lock system. For safety reasons. in case maintenance personnel got locked in. The notation was 4 millimeters tall. He'd read it through the gap he'd opened between the panel and the wall while he was unscrewing it. Prath made a sound when I showed her this. A high, involuntary sound that in her species indicates cognitive dissonance. I understood the feeling. So he's loose on the station, said Orvash, my tactical officer, the heaviest presence on my team, a species whose emotional range tends toward the practical end of the spectrum. He said it the way you might say so there's a small fire in the kitchen, acknowledging the fact before assessing the response. And, he's building something. Yes. Do we know what? I have a theory. What's the theory? I'd rather not say until I have more information. Orvash's expression moved into the configuration that, in his species, means, I respect you, but I think you're doing something professionally inadvisable. Sir. If he's building a weapon, he's not building a weapon. A pause. How do you know? Because if he wanted to hurt us, he's had 6 opportunities to do it already. He knows where the cameras are. He's demonstrated he can move through this station without being detected when he wants to. He let us see him on deck 7. He let us watch him. He waved. Silence. He waved, Orvash repeated. At camera 7 to 4, yes. Why? I picked up my coffee. It was cold now, and somehow worse for it. I don't know yet. That also seems like something we should know, sir. Yes, I agreed. It does. At hour 11 of the incident, something changed on the heat trace grid. He'd stopped moving. Not paused, the kind of brief, scouting stillness I'd been tracking all day. Stopped. Sustained, stable body temperature in one location, deck 4, section C, starboard side. Sitting or lying down. And, then, the sound came through. I had audio monitoring on all decks as standard protocol, low sensitivity ambient feed, mostly to catch mechanical failures and pressure changes before they became structural events. When the sound came, it tripped the sensitivity filter and flagged my console. I put on the audio. It was the humming. Same tuneless rolling melody I'd heard before, but now clearer, more sustained. Not anxious. Not bravado. The particular quality of sound a creature makes when it is alone and not performing for anyone, which was either a genuine lapse in his awareness of the monitoring or a very sophisticated manipulation of it. I sat there and listened to it for longer than I should have. There's a word in my language, Urith, for the feeling of recognizing something you can't name. A shape you've seen before but can't place. It doesn't translate well, but that's the closest I can come. I sat there listening to this human make a sound with his throat in the poisoned dark of a decommissioned station and felt Urith in a way I hadn't felt it since my first field assignment. Sir, Prath said, from across the room, very carefully. The Deck 4 Section C camera is showing something. I pulled up the feed. He'd found a corner of what used to be an officer's break room, chairs overturned, table bolted down, emergency lighting at about 30%. He'd dragged one of the chairs upright and he was sitting in it, and he'd laid out the components he'd gathered across the tabletop in a very deliberate order. He was assembling something. But, not quickly. He worked for a while, then, stopped, then, just sat there in the half-light and hummed, then, worked again. At one point he put his head back against the chair and looked at the ceiling for several minutes. He looked tired. Not defeated. There's a difference, and I've been trained to read it. Defeated is a specific slump, a quality of stillness that is surrender. This was the tired of someone who was rationing themselves. Carefully. Knowing they have further to go. I shouldn't have found that affecting. I found it affecting. What's he building, sir? Prath asked again, and this time her voice had something else in it, not fear, but the thing that comes after fear when the situation has gone on long enough to start feeling like something else entirely. I looked at the components on the table. Power cells. Frequency modulator. Pressure tubing. Conductive casings. A transmitter, I said. The room went quiet. Not the normal quiet of people processing new information. The specific, weighted quiet of people who have simultaneously realized the same thing. He's sending a signal, Orvash said slowly. He's been sending a signal. Since the moment he let us see him on deck 7. I set my cold, terrible coffee down. He didn't need us to see him. He needed us to chase him. Across every deck he collected components on. He needed us watching the wrong thing. He was buying time, Prath said. For what? I looked at the transmitter on the table. At the frequency modulator he'd extracted from a relay that hadn't been serviced in 23 years. At the power cells from an emergency cache. At the range that combination would give him. At who, in this sector, operated on civilian subspace frequencies. The cold started somewhere behind my primary sternum and spread outward. Someone's coming, I said. I filed the alert at hour 11:22. Automated priority flag, full sector broadcast, requesting identification of any vessel within communication range of Meridian 9 on civilian subspace frequencies. The response came back in 4 minutes. One vessel had responded to a civilian subspace signal in the last 3 hours. A collective monitoring ship, designation KR-7, had intercepted a partial transmission and altered course toward our position. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. Estimated. Based on standard drive profiles. Based on standard drive profiles. I pulled Vance's full redacted file again. I looked at the 11 redaction bars over his service history. I thought about the information broker who had found him, conveniently, at a waypoint station, trying to sell documents he clearly hadn't needed to sell, because a man who could read 4mm maintenance schematics in the dark and build a signal transmitter from a junction box and a drainage cover was not a man who needed to sell cargo manifests for money. I thought about the question my people stopped asking. What do you do when the thing you are hunting decides it wants to be found? On the feed, Vance had stopped humming. He was looking at the transmitter. And then, and I would swear to this under any veridical scan available in the known galaxy, he looked up. Not at the camera. At the ceiling. Like he was looking through it. At me. He smiled. It was not, as some of my colleagues have described human smiles, unnerving or predatory. It wasn't threatening. It was patient. The smile of someone who has completed a plan. The smile of someone who was always going to end up exactly here. There are protocols for this. I want to be clear about that, because the review board is going to ask, and I want it on the record, there are protocols for exactly this kind of situation, and I know them, and I began executing them the moment I confirmed the incoming vessel. Seal all external docking access. Realign the station's identification beacon to a null signal. Redirect internal power to the containment grid. Request emergency backup through the nearest Union relay. I did all of these things. I am telling you this so you understand that what happened next was not a failure of procedure. It was a failure of assumption. Specifically, the assumption that the things I was doing would be sufficient. Specifically the assumption that I was still the one running the scenario. Backup request is sitting in queue, Brovith said. Her tendrils had gone fully tight, a bad sign, in Kelshan body language. It means the nervous system has decided there's nothing casual left to signal. Nearest relay is waypoint 4. Earliest response window is 9 hours. 3 hours after the KR-7 arrived. If the KR-7 was running standard drive profiles. If. Seal the docking collars, I said. All of them. Emergency code, no override. Already done, sir. But, she stopped. But, what? Sir. The station's external maintenance airlocks. They're not on the containment grid. They're on the engineering grid. They use different authorization systems. I looked at her. How many external maintenance airlocks, I said. 7. And, the engineering grid authorization is a standard union maintenance code. It's in every engineer's handbook. Published. Publicly accessible. The cold from earlier was back. Deeper now. Can we seal them manually? They're on decks 2, 3, 4, deck 4, section B and C, and deck 6. Deck 4. Section C, starboard side. Where Vance was sitting. I pulled up the deck 4 camera. He was gone. The transmitter was still on the table, which meant I understood this immediately. The way you understand something that your brain has been building toward without telling you, the transmitter was not the endgame. The transmitter was the misdirection. I'd been watching the transmitter. He'd stopped humming. He'd moved. Where is he? I said. Prath was already running the heat trace. Deck 4 section B, she stopped. He's at the maintenance airlock. Can we beat him there? A pause. The pause told me everything. Orvash, I said. Take Kellen and get to section B. Now. They were out of the room before I finished the sentence. Orvash doesn't ask questions in motion. It's one of the things that makes him valuable and, occasionally, alarming. Prath, keep the heat trace on him. Give Orvash a live feed to his unit. Yes, sir. I stood at the main console and looked at the map and tried to think. Which is difficult when you're doing it fast, because thinking fast tends to collapse itself around what you already believe, and what I already believed had been wrong since approximately hour 1. Here is what I knew. Vance had spent 9 hours in a cell working a plan he'd read from a 4mm maintenance schematic. He'd moved through this station for 11 hours in a poison environment wearing a suit he'd made from ceiling insulation and a drainage cover. He'd built a signal transmitter from components he'd identified in advance, from a relay he'd known about, using a frequency that would reach a specific ship. None of this was improvised in any real sense. He'd known, before he ever arrived on this station, what was available to him. He'd known the maintenance airlock codes. He'd known the grid structure. He'd known the communications relay. Which meant he'd had access to information about Meridian 9 before he arrived. Which meant someone had given it to him. Which meant Chess, the broker who'd turned him over, had not been selling him. She'd been placing him. I pulled up Chess's file. Mid-tier broker, 6 years of small-scale information trading, no major collective affiliations on record. Picked Vance up on Waypoint Station with what the arrest report described as a routine tip. A routine tip. On a man who doesn't do routine anything. Prath, I said. Sir? Chess. The broker who transferred Vance. Who paid her? The Union Standard Transfer Bounty, sir. Through the pause. Through the Waypoint 4 Relay Office. And the Waypoint 4 Relay Office is who authorized our backup request. Silence. Sir, Prath said slowly, that might be a coincidence. It might be, I agreed. We looked at each other. Orvash reached Deck 4 Section B in 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which is fast, and sent a feed from his unit. The airlock door was closed. Vance was standing in front of it. He had his hands at his sides. He was not attempting to open it. He was just standing there, in his garbage suit, with the neurotoxin haze thinning around him because Section B's ventilation was better than 7's, and, when Orvash came around the corner with Kellen, Vance turned around. And, he said, I have this on audio, I've listened to it 11 times since, he said, hey. Good timing. Orvash, who has the social instincts of a particularly pragmatic geological formation, said, step away from the door. In a minute, Vance said. Step away from the door now. I'll tell you what, Vance said, in the tone of someone suggesting a reasonable compromise in a business meeting, why don't you come stand next to me, and, then, I can show you something, and, then, we can decide together. Orvash looked at his feed unit. At me, through the camera. Show us from there, Orvash said. Vance smiled. Shrugged. Pulled something from inside the insulation suit, and Orvash and Kellen both moved, went immediately to stance, weapons raised, and it was small. Flat. A data chip, the civilian kind, held up between 2 fingers. It's a data chip, Vance said pleasantly. What's on it? Orvash said, weapons still up. A conversation I recorded 18 months ago. You're going to want to hear it. But, and, he turned and put his free hand flat on the airlock door, and there was a sound, a low, pressurized thud from the other side, something that had docked against the station's exterior. I'd really like to do the introductions first. I don't have a good word for what happened next, in my own language or in any of the 12 other languages I have functional fluency in. The airlock opened from outside, which requires an engineering code. The engineering code is public. The person on the other side of the airlock knew it. But, the person who came through the airlock was not who I expected. Not a collective agent. Not a rescue team. Not anyone I'd considered in any configuration of my emergency modeling. She was a Union Internal Affairs investigator. Her name was Senior Auditor Drisvellen. She had a union certification badge, active and authenticated. Prath checked it in real time. I watched her do it, and she had 2 armed officers behind her, and she had the particular expression of someone who has been working a very long case and is deeply satisfied to be in this room. She looked at Orvash. At his weapons. You can put those down, she said. Orvash looked at me through his feed unit again. Stand down, I said. The words came out steady. I was proud of that. She briefed me in the station's derelict conference room on Deck 3, and I will condense what took 2 hours into the version that matters. The Waypoint 4 relay office. The one through which our backup request was sitting in queue. The one through which Shessa's bounty had been processed. It had been, for approximately 4 years, operating as a dual-function facility. On the surface, Union Relay and Administrative Office. Underneath, a collective information clearinghouse. Transit records. Containment schedules. Prisoner movements. The individuals running it had been clever about it. They'd identified which officers were scheduled for which containment rotations. They'd identified which stations would be used. They'd identified which transfers would move through their office. Vance had been on a collective operation targeting that clearinghouse for 14 months. He'd gotten close enough to confirm the key personnel and extract partial evidence, but not close enough to access the complete record set, which was stored on a physical chip at the office itself, requiring an in-person operative to retrieve it. The problem with being an operative targeting a facility that tracks prisoner movements and containment schedules is that the facility knows you're coming. He'd been burned. Identified. A bounty placed through channels that felt legitimate. Shess hadn't been placing him on this station. She genuinely turned him over, for genuinely good money, through the genuinely compromised relay office that then, promptly moved him to the most isolated containment facility in the sector. Away from the investigation. Away from his team. To Meridian 9, where no one would come, and no one would look. And, all of that, every piece of it, was on the data chip. Because somewhere in the 9 hours he'd spent in that cell, Vance had finished putting together a picture he'd been assembling for 14 months. The maintenance schematic in the ventilation panel hadn't just given him the lock sequence. It had given him the station ID. The grid signatures. The administrative codes that traced back to Waypoint 4. He'd read it, and he'd understood what it meant, and he'd spent the rest of those 9 hours building a plan around the thing he had now confirmed. He was not trapped on this station. The station was the last piece of his case. He let us catch him, Prath said. We were standing in the conference room, Drisvellen having stepped out to begin arrest processing of, and this is where it lands in a way that I still feel when I say it, 2 members of the Union contingent at Waypoint 4. People I had filed reports through. People whose authorization codes had approved my assignment here. He let Shess catch him, I said. He needed a controlled transfer. Somewhere he could build a transmission. Somewhere quiet enough that the signal would reach Drisvellen's ship, the KR-7, which is not a collective ship, it's a Union Iowa deep cover vessel, without being crowded out by standard traffic. He knew the IA ship would be listening for him, Prath said. He'd arranged it. Before he was caught. 14 months of groundwork. He set his own arrest in motion knowing the compromised relay would put him here. Then, he built the transmitter and sent a signal on a frequency that only the IA ship was monitoring for. He was never in danger. I thought about it. The neurotoxin cloud. The 9 hours of patient work in a locked cell. The garbage suit built from ceiling panels. The 2 hours spent unscrewing a ventilation cover with a jacket button. He was in danger, I said. Continuously. The entire thing could have gone wrong at 15 different points. If we'd recognized the transmitter components before he finished it. If Drisvellen's ship had been positioned differently. If Chess had sold him somewhere other than here. But, he did it anyway. I looked at the chair in the corner where Vance was sitting, waiting, while his debrief was being organized. He'd taken the garbage suit off. He was in his uniform, which was dirty and smelled, I imagined, like neurotoxin and ceiling insulation. He was drinking from a ration pack Orvash had given him, because Orvash is professionally practical and keeping a priority witness in acceptable physical condition is tactically sensible. He was humming again. It's the only move he had, I said. He'd identified the clearinghouse. He had partial evidence but not the complete record. He needed to transmit the full case file to an IA investigator who'd already been briefed, from a location clean enough that the signal couldn't be interfered with, through a system that the compromised relay office couldn't block. So he walked into a trap. On purpose. Inside a trap he was already building. Not walked, I said. There's a word in Keltian, I learned it from Bruvith, for the feeling of a current that looks like still water until you're already in it. What does it mean? Something like you should have been paying more attention upstream. Prath made the involuntary sound again. Drisvellen came back into the conference room with the kind of expression that means a very large amount of work has just become significantly more manageable. Vance will need to be transported to central processing for full deposition, she said. The IA case is live as of 40 minutes ago. The 2 officers at Waypoint 4 are in custody. There are an estimated 11 additional individuals in the network. 11, I said. Conservative estimate. And, the broker, Chess? She's cooperating. She didn't know what she was part of. The bounty payment looked clean. I looked at the chip on the table. Small, flat, civilian grade. Everything a 14-month operation required, in a format that fit between 2 fingers, carried by a man through a neurotoxin cloud in a suit made of garbage. One question, I said. Ask. He had to know, when he set this up, that he'd be going into containment for an unknown period. That we'd flood the station. That there was a real possibility the plan failed and he died here. She looked at me. Not impatiently. The look of someone who's heard a version of this question before and has thought about the answer. Yes. And he did it anyway. He had a case that needed closing, she said. And a team that needed the network identified. A pause. The 11 individuals in that network have been feeding asset locations to the collective for 4 years. His team has lost people because of it. The humming from the corner of the room drifted in through the conference room's half-open door. I thought about Vance in his cell. Sleeping first, deliberately, like an athlete before a competition. Then, sitting and looking at the door with that wide, absorbing stillness. Then, finding the panel, the schematic, the 4mm notation. Not luck. Not improvisation. Preparation meeting the available circumstances. He took good care of his suit, Orvash said from the doorway. He'd been standing there long enough that I wasn't sure when he'd arrived. The insulation strips. The seals. He checked them 3 times before he entered the Halcyon 4 zone. Methodical. You've been reviewing the footage, I said. Yes. Any conclusions? Orvash considered this for a moment. I would have used the belt differently, he said. We transferred Vance to Drisvellen's ship at hour 17. I walked him to the airlock myself. I don't know why. It wasn't protocol. He didn't need an escort. At this point the situation had inverted so completely that the word prisoner had become functionally inapplicable. He walked beside me without saying anything for most of the corridor, which I appreciated. At the airlock, he stopped. "You tried to gas me 4 times, he said. 3, I said. The 4th was a pressure flush, technically a different system. He made a small sound that I have since learned is the human version of fair enough. For what it's worth, you ran it right. The containment protocols were solid. If I hadn't already had the schematics, the suit would have been a different conversation. I considered this for a moment. If you hadn't already had the schematics, you wouldn't have let yourself be brought here." He smiled. Not the patient, plan-complete smile from the camera. Something smaller. No. Probably not. "One thing," I said. "Yeah?" The waving. At camera 7 to 4. He looked at me. "Why?" He was quiet for a second. "Then, because I'd been watching your team's movements for 6 hours and you were all running clean. No hesitation, no gaps, no signs of compromise. I needed to know if your backup request would go through the relay office the way I thought it would." He paused. "Wanted to make sure you'd been told no help was coming. So the wave was confirmation. If you'd come down to Section 7 yourself, response time under 10 minutes, full team, the relay was fine, your request went through. I'd have had to change the plan." "You didn't come down," I said. "No. 12 minutes, 2 personnel, standard response. The request sat in queue. The relay was dirty." He looked at the airlock door. I needed to know which. I looked at him. "You were running an asset assessment," I said. "On me." "On the station," he said, which was technically a different answer that meant the same thing. I thought about the 11 people in the network. About the assets they'd burned. About 14 months and a plan built around a 4mm notation in a ventilation panel. "I passed," I said. "Yeah," Vance said. "You did." The airlock opened. He walked through. I stood in the corridor of the nail for a while, next to my own terrible coffee that I'd somehow carried all the way from the command room, and I thought about the shape of what had happened here. The nested layers of it. The way the trap and the escape and the investigation were all the same structure, moving through this station like water through pipes that he had known, in advance, were there. I thought about the question. What do you do when the thing you are hunting decides it wants to be found? The answer, apparently, is that you help it finish. Whether you know it or not. The report took me 9 days. I'm known, among my colleagues, for clean reports. Fast, structured, accurate. I've had 3 commendations for documentation efficiency in 11 years. Subcommander Valharius files that close with no follow-up requests, no ambiguity flags, no secondary review. The Meridian 9 incident report was on its 7th revision when I sent it. Not because the facts were complicated. The facts were actually very simple: 1 human prisoner, 1 improvised transmitter, 1 compromised relay office, 1 14-month intelligence operation resolved. Clean chain of custody. All personnel accounted for. Full documentation of the containment breach, the construction of the suit, the access of the maintenance airlock. The part 1 kept revising was the assessment section. Specifically, the part where I was supposed to characterize the subject's behavior pattern for the archive. I kept writing things and, then, deleting them. Not because they were inaccurate. Because they were insufficient. Every clinical framework I tried felt like describing a ship by listing its hull rivets. My 9th attempt read, subject demonstrated exceptional situational analysis and adaptive behavior under sustained containment pressure, including improvised environmental protection, covert communications array construction, and multistage operational misdirection. Accurate. Completely accurate. Also, it captured nothing. The 10th attempt was 2 sentences long and I sent it before I could revise it again. I'll get to what it said. Drisvelen sent me a case update 3 days after the transfer. The kind of professional courtesy she didn't know me, offered freely, which I've thought about. The 11 network members had become 14. 2 had been arrested. 3 were under active surveillance. 9 were in the process of having their operational security quietly dismantled in ways that would, she explained, generate arrests over the following 6 to 8 months without alerting the remainder of the network. Choos was cooperating and would likely receive a mitigation arrangement. The Waypoint 4 relay office had been taken offline under administrative review. Vance was in deposition. He expects this to take a while, she wrote. He's thorough. I believe that, I wrote back. There was a pause in the correspondence, and then she sent one more line. He asked me to tell you, the coffee at Central Processing is actually decent. I looked at my cup. It tasted like it always did. Here is what I didn't put in the report. On the morning of day 3, the second day after Vance left, while I was still on station completing handover procedures, I went down to Deck 4. Not for any procedural reason. The investigation was done. The evidence had been catalogued and transferred. There was nothing on Deck 4 that required my presence. I went anyway. Section C. The old break room. The overturned chairs and the bolted table and the emergency lighting at 30%. The transmitter was still there. Dris Vellen's team had photographed and catalogued it, but they'd left it in place pending the formal evidence collection that was coming with the secondary investigation team. It sat on the table exactly as Vance had left it, components in sequence, connections made. A power cell, a frequency modulator from a 23-year-old relay, pressure tubing, conductive casing. The civilian drainage cover that had been the faceplate of his environmental suit lay folded beside it. I stood there and looked at it. The break room still smelled faintly of Halcyon 4, which in its dissipated state smells like copper and something sweet and wrong. Under that, something else, the particular warm metal smell of recent electronics work. The smell of something being built. I pulled out a chair and sat down. I want to be precise about what I was thinking, because I've tried to be precise about everything in this account and I want to be precise about this too. I wasn't having a crisis of professional confidence. I wasn't questioning my competence or the competence of my team. We'd run the protocols correctly. We'd been operating on false information, installed before we ever arrived, by people who were supposed to be our own infrastructure. What I was thinking about was the 9 hours in the cell. The sleeping first. The looking at the door. I've run containment operations for 11 years. I have seen trapped things. I have seen things that were caught and knew it and operated on the raw terror of that knowledge. I have seen things that were caught and didn't understand it and operated on instinct, which is its own kind of terror to watch. I have seen things that were experienced enough to accept capture as a temporary state and wait for a clean opportunity. I had never seen someone for whom being caught was the plan. Not the fallback. Not the calculated risk. The plan. 9 hours in that cell, and he had already known. He'd confirmed what he needed to confirm from the maintenance schematic, and then he'd slept, because you sleep when you can, and then he'd sat and looked at the door, not a door he was trying to open, not a door that was trapping him, but a door he was about to use, with the particular stillness of someone who has set a very complicated machine in motion and is simply waiting for the first gear to turn. He'd been afraid. I don't have evidence for this, but I believe it. 14 months. 11 people in a network that had burned his team's assets. The real possibility that the relay was clean, the request went through, the station flooded and backup came in 4 hours and the plan fell apart. The fear would have been real. He had done it anyway. Sir. Orvash was in the doorway. He has a very quiet way of appearing in doorways, for a creature his size. I've never decided if it's tactful or alarming. I'm not doing anything unusual, I said. I didn't say you were. You have the face. He considered this. I have a face, he said, which in his particular phrasing is a correction, not an agreement. I came to tell you the secondary investigation team's ETA has been pushed to day 6. The handover documentation is complete on our end. Good. He didn't leave. Is there something else? I've been reviewing the containment logs, Orvash said. The full record. From the moment he arrived. And a pause. Orvash uses pauses differently than most people, not to gather words, but to evaluate whether the words he has are the right ones. I'd been thinking about the wave. I waited. He used us, Orvash said. The wave, the heat trace, the suit. He needed us to do exactly what we did. Report to the relay. Run the containment protocol. Chase the heat signature. Yes. He designed an operation that ran on our competence. If we'd been slower, he would have had to adapt. If we'd been faster, a pause. If we'd found the transmitter before he finished it. He would have adapted, I said. Different path. Same destination. Maybe. Orvash looked at the transmitter on the table. At the makeshift suit. At the junction box casing that had been a prison 4 days ago and was now evidence. I want to know what the other paths were. What do you mean? He had contingencies. He always had contingencies. He looked at me. The transmitter was not the only way out of this station. I looked at him. What did you find? I said. I'd been running the structural logs for the full 17 hours. Mapping his movements against the station's systems. Orvash stepped into the room, pulled out the chair across from mine, sat down. An unusual thing for Orvash, who generally prefers to stand. He went through Section B on hour 14. Before the airlock. I know. That's when we lost his heat trace briefly. 3 minutes, Orvash said. I went to Section B this morning to check. And? Emergency maintenance kit, Bay 4B is sealed. Undisturbed. He put something on the table. A small toolkit, the emergency kind, Union Standard issue. Sealed. Undisturbed, as he'd said. But, the bay's inner casing, the one that covers the kit from the corridor, has fresh marks on the fastening screws. Scratches, consistent with something thin and hard. Like a jacket button. Like the one he'd used on the cell's ventilation panel. He opened it, I said. Opened it. Checked the contents. Resealed it. 3 minutes. Orvash sat back. He didn't need anything in it. He already had everything he needed. But, he checked. He was assessing options, I said slowly. He was keeping his exits open. I looked at the sealed kit. At the fresh marks on the fastening screws. He'd built the transmitter. He'd arranged the IA contact. He'd confirmed the relay compromise using us as instruments. He'd done all of it, and then, in his way from one side of this station to the other, he had stopped and opened an emergency kit he didn't need just to know what was in it. Just to know, if everything else collapsed, what his last option was. He was never only running one plan, I said. No. Orvash picked up the kit and turned it in his large hands. I think there were at least 3 running simultaneously. The transmitter was the preferred outcome. The airlock Velen's ship was the confirmed exit once the case was solid. And there was something else. What? He put the kit back. I don't know. I think that's the point. I don't think he ever intended to use it. I think he had it available the way you keep the emergency sealant in the kit, not because you expect the hull to breach, but because if it does, you want the 3 seconds of not having to think about where it is. The break room was quiet. Somewhere in the station's ventilation, the last traces of halcyon-4 were dissipating, cycling through filters that were not designed for extended chemical saturation and would need to be replaced. A small maintenance issue in a decommissioned station that nobody used. The kind of thing that goes in a footnote. Put it in the supplemental, I said. The kit, the marks, the assessment. All of it. Yes, sir. The secondary investigation team arrived on day 6 and took 3 days to complete their documentation. I was on station for all of it, which was not strictly required but which I found I needed to be. There is a thing that happens, sometimes, when an incident closes a particular flatness, a sense of everything returning to ambient noise, and I found that flatness uncomfortable in a way I didn't entirely recognize. The chief investigator, a methodical woman named Ossarin, asked me directly on day 8 if I had anything to add to the file report beyond what was documented. I thought about 9 hours in a cell and the sleeping and the stillness and the door. I thought about Deck 7 and the wave. I thought about the emergency kit with the fresh marks on its screws, in a corridor, 3 minutes, a man who didn't need what was inside it but opened it anyway because not knowing was the one thing he didn't leave room for. Everything's in the supplemental, I said. Day 9. Report filed. 7th revision. The assessment section, final version, 2 sentences, subject demonstrated sustained operational capacity under extreme environmental stress, including improvised material construction, multistage communications work, and concurrent contingency maintenance over a period of 17 hours. Risk assessment models based on standard human behavioral profiles are insufficient for this case and are recommended for revision. I sent it. I made coffee. It was, as always, wrong. I drank it anyway. Here is the part one have not told anyone. On the last night I was on station, waiting for the secondary team to finish, I went back to Deck 4. To the break room. I don't have a good explanation for this. Professionally, everything that needed to be done had been done. The transmitter was logged and tagged. The suit materials were logged and tagged. The kit in Bay 4B, freshly opened and resealed, was logged and tagged. I went anyway. I sat in the chair. I thought about the question, the one my people stopped asking, the one that ends careers and lives and the kind of sleep you can count on, and I thought about what the answer was. What do you do when the thing you are hunting decides it wants to be found? The honest answer, I think, is a nothing. You don't do anything in particular. You run the protocols. You execute the procedures correctly. You are, as I had apparently been without knowing it, exactly what the plan required. The thing that unsettled me, and I am choosing this word carefully, unsettled, not frightened, not disturbed, because both of those words point towards something more acute than what I mean, was not that I had been used. That I could process. Operations used the available terrain. Vance had used this station, and its systems, and the compromised relay, and my team's professional responses. That I could understand. What I couldn't entirely absorb was the patience of it. 14 months. The plan that made the arrest possible. The 9 hours in the cell. The careful sleeping. The wide, absorbing look at the door. There is a commitment to outcome that is different from determination. Determination pushes against resistance. What I'd watched on those surveillance feeds was something that didn't push at all, it accommodated, and waited, and moved through the available gaps with the quiet patience of something that has decided the outcome will be reached and is simply allocating effort appropriately until that point. I don't know what to call it. My language doesn't have a single word for it, and neither do the 11 others I speak. I do know that when I think about the 11 people in the network 14 now, and growing, who had been watching his team's operational movements for 4 years, who had thought they knew the ground and the players and the available moves, I know they thought they had him. I know how that feels. And, I know, sitting in that break room on the last night, in the dark and the copper smell and the fading Halcyon 4, that the moment they thought that was probably the moment the plan shifted from I need to close this case to I know how to close this case. The chip was small. Flat. Civilian grade. It fit between 2 fingers. It had traveled through 9 hours of locked isolation, 11 hours of a neurotoxin cloud, and an airlock on Deck 4 of a decommissioned station called the Nail, in a suit made of sealing insulation and a drainage cover, built by a man humming a tuneless song to himself in the green-lit dark. And now it was going to take down 14 people who had thought, for 4 years, that they were running a very tight operation. I sat in the chair in the break room and I finished my terrible coffee. Then, I logged the final handover entry, sealed my notes, picked up my kit, and walked to the airlock. The station lights were on their automated cycle, 3/4 power at this hour, pale and institutional. The corridor smelled like recycled air and old metal and the specific particular nothing smell of a place that has been empty for too long. Somewhere in the ventilation, the last of the Halcyon 4. Gone, or close enough. I thought about the backup requests sitting in queue, and the relay office, and the 2 officers being processed through Union Internal Affairs, and the 9 additional individuals whose operational security was being quietly, carefully, methodically disassembled by people who'd been briefed from a data chip carried out of this place on a Tuesday. I thought about Vance at Central Processing. Thorough, Dris Velen had said. The decent coffee. I thought about what Thorough probably looks like, for him. The same patient stillness I'd watched on the feeds. The same careful allocation of everything available. The deposition that would take a while. I stepped into the airlock. The outer door opened, and there was the black, and the cold, and the debris field, and the stars going on in all directions without comment on any of this. I filed my final entry, Meridian 9 Containment Incident. Status, closed. And then, I went to find coffee that actually tasted like something. 3 months later, Internal Affairs Case 7741A resulted in the arrest or administrative removal of 19 individuals across 6 Union relay facilities. Subcommander Valharius received a commendation for the Meridian 9 documentation. The risk assessment model was not revised.